One of the most vicious and high-profile political contests in the state of Texas was the 1990 gubernatorial campaign between Clayton Williams and Ann Richards. In a fantastic piece, Professor Brandon Rottinghouse wrote about the election. He quoted Molly Ivins, who described Williams as the perfect representative of a vanishing Texas, a character that could have come from Giant. Williams was a Midland multimillionaire who had made his money in oil and gas, real estate, and telecommunications. His opponent, the Democrat, Ann Richards, was the sitting state treasurer and a former county commissioner in Travis County. Richards had defeated the Attorney General, Jim Maddox, in a challenging Democratic primary. She also possessed a sharp sense of humor and the ability to deliver a well-timed barb. When the campaign started, the polls showed Williams with a 27-point lead, and then he started talking. He started by comparing rape to bad weather. He was talking about on his ranch that, sometimes when he said rape is like bad weather. When it's inevitable, it's just important to lay back and enjoy it. He talked about when he was a young man visiting prostitutes, and he also admitted that he had trouble campaigning against a woman. And then he made light of Richard's sobriety. When polls had showed the race had closed a little bit, he said, "I hope that Ann hasn't started drinking again." Even with all this, he continued to lead by 12 points. The final straw was after one of the campaign debates when he refused to shake Ann Richards' hand because he believed that she had lied about his bank in Midland being engaged in money laundering for drug smugglers. Besides his lack of manners, Williams also refused to release his tax returns, and he inadvertently revealed that he did not pay any income taxes in 1986 following the collapse of oil prices. It reinforced a narrative that there were tax breaks that were available only to the wealthy. Ann Richards won the election by 99,000 votes, which was about 2 percentage points, and one of the big driving forces behind the election was a large gender gap, where women overwhelmingly voted for Ann Richards while men voted for Clayton Williams. And this election, is almost historic in some respects for what Ann Richards had did in terms of using his own words in television ads. Richards had painted Williams someone who was a wheeler-dealer who lacked substance, and Ann Richards focused on turning out her base, figuring that there were still enough Democrats in Texas to win a campaign. And so Ann Richards was the last Democrat to win the governor's mansion in Texas history. Citizens in the United States vote more frequently than citizens in any other country of the world because there are many different types of elections that are governed by different sets of rules. The first step in the process is that parties choose their nominees through primaries. The parties provide the framework, but the voters in each of the parties determines who will represent the party during the general election. So in a primary election, you have multiple candidates all sharing the same party affiliation, and the voters are responsible for making that decision. The primaries were adopted in the early part of the 20th century in order to weaken party leaders by democratizing the process. So instead of having the party leaders determine the candidate, the voters would determine the candidate. And this would allow the voters to determine who got a spot on the ballot. The first direct primary occurred in 1906 after the legislature passed the Terror Election Law of 1903. The primary system was also closely intertwined with questions of race. In 1924, Lawrence Nixon of El Paso tried to vote in the Democratic primary, and when he was denied, he filed a lawsuit against the state of Texas. The United States Supreme Court ruled in Mr. Nixon's favor, so Texas changed its laws so the state was no longer in charge of determining the rules. The parties were responsible. Democrats wanted to prohibit African Americans from voting because of racial dislike and the fact that African Americans often voted Republican and could dominate some districts. 20 years later, in Smith v. Allwright, the Supreme Court ruled that Lonnie Smith, a dentist from Houston, should be able to participate in primaries because they were essential to the political process, and the states could not delegate responsibility to the parties for setting the rules. Change was also slow to come for Latinos in Texas, but as we talked about earlier in the semester, Dr. Hector Garcia had founded the American GI Forum to help press for greater political equality for Latinos, and Henry Gonzalez was the first Latino elected to the Texas Senate in the 1950s. However, the 1960s were pivotal because of the development of organizations like PASO, the Political Association of Spanish-Speaking Organizations, and the development of Viva Kennedy clubs. As your textbook notes, Texas has an open primary that allows a voter to decide which primary they want to participate in, so voters are free to change between election cycles. The rules are important because Texas requires a candidate to win a majority of the vote. 50% plus 1, rather than a simple plurality in order to win the nomination. If no candidate wins a majority of the vote in the primary, the top 2 vote getters advance to what's called a runoff election. In the 85th legislature, some members have introduced bills that would change some of these rules. For example, Representatives Mike Lang of Granbury and Matt Rinaldi of Irving propose restricting primary participation only to registered party members, while Raphael Anchia proposed ending partisan primaries and advancing the top 2 candidates regardless of party to the general election. Given the lopsided party competition in Texas, winning the Republican primary is often the most important contest for a candidate. General elections, in contrast to primary elections, are regularly scheduled affairs that occur on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. These have always been conducted, and the winner of a general election earns a term of office, and that of course depends on what office you win. If you win a seat in the state legislature, it's 2 years. If you're elected governor, it's 4 years, and so forth. In the general election, a plurality of the vote, whoever gets the most votes, is the winner. Members of the plural executive in Texas are not elected during presidential election years. There are also a variety of special elections in Texas that occur for 3 different reasons. If there are vacancies in Congress, when there are constitutional elections, and then municipal elections, which are theoretically nonpartisan, and municipal elections are city and county elections. The 2 major parties are guaranteed spots on the ballot, and candidates who wish to run must either submit signatures on a nominating petition or pay a filing fee. One important factor that influences what Texans see on their ballots is that there are deadlines in order to appear on primary ballots. So the rules for 2018 haven't been set, but for 2016 the primary is on March the 1st, and if you wanted to run for office, you had to make a decision by December 14th, 2015. For minor parties, if they received 5% of the vote in the previous election, they automatically qualified for the ballot. But if they fell below that threshold, they needed to petition to gain a place on the ballot. The petition requires the signatures of 1% of the votes cast in that election, and so for a statewide position in 2016, that would be about 47,200 signatures. For an independent candidate who wants to run for a position in the state legislature, they would need 500 signatures on a nominating petition. This particularly ugly figure shows you where the voting patterns in Texas over the last almost 50 years. You see a fairly familiar pattern in this graph where voter turnout is greater in presidential elections, the green line, as compared to midterm and gubernatorial elections, the purple line. Voter turnout in Texas is relatively low, especially compared to the national average. It's approximately 10 to 15 percentage points less. So even though we have a fairly high percentage of registered voters, the black line approaching almost 80%, a lot of them simply don't vote. So the average percentage of voters in Texas right now is about 71%. In gubernatorial elections, the average voter turnout is about 28%. In presidential elections, the average voter turnout is about 45%. You see at the bottom, the Democratic primaries in blue and the Republican primaries in red. Turnout in Democratic primaries is about 17%, but after 1994, that drops in half to about 8%. Whereas Republican turnout over the period is about 8%, but after 1994 it goes up to about 9.5%. And then that orange line shows you turnout in constitutional elections, 8.3%. So when we have constitutional elections where we're changing the state constitution, those are often decided by a relatively small number of voters. As elections become less high profile, voter turnout tends to decline. As we noted, there were legal barriers to voting, and we'll come back to that again. But other factors play a role as well. Higher rates of poverty, which often means lower levels of education and income among African Americans and Latinos, results in lower voter turnout. There's a political structure that decentralizes authority, and so that creates a longer ballot, which makes it more challenging for people to vote. And there hasn't been much two-party competition, along with the political culture of the state that does not reward or prize voting. The social and economic elite of the state of Texas vote and run the political process in order to maintain their position and prevent outsiders from having influence. And you see strains of this in the Tea Party movement. One of the big issues in Texas right now is that of Latino voters. Latinos are one of the largest blocks of voters, but voter participation is relatively low. And Latino voters face twin challenges of citizenship and language. Based on the data that we have available, 79% of registered voters with Hispanic surnames. You don't register to vote based on ethnicity in Texas, so we're kind of making an estimate here, but 79% of registered voters with Hispanic surnames do not vote in Texas. Scholars have studied voting behavior in the United States extensively, and the two most important predictors of whether people will vote are age and education. Quite simply, as people get older, they're more likely to vote. Higher levels of education are also increase the likelihood of voting because people acquire more knowledge and greater skills that enable them to overcome the hurdles that are associated with voting, giving people more skills to participate in the process. Among the different racial and ethnic groups in Texas, whites and African Americans vote at similar levels, and their overall rates remain low. However, whites and African Americans vote at much higher rates than Latinos because of citizenship concerns, larger numbers of residents under the age of 18, and lower levels of assimilation. I'll often encourage you to vote so that you can participate in the electoral process, but there is a question of rationality. Generally speaking, we engage in activity when the benefits outweigh the costs, right? What are the direct benefits of voting? Think about that for a few minutes. And then think about what are the costs of voting. What winds up happening is that for many people, the costs of voting clearly outweigh the benefits of voting, and there's also a relatively small chance that any one vote would be decisive, which raises a question about why people vote. People vote out of a sense of duty, but that does challenge some of our conclusions that we have about why people behave the way that they do. And so the fact that people vote, even though it's not rational, is something known as the paradox of voting. Voting is an essential aspect of Republican government, and it can change the balance of power in Austin or in Washington, D.C., and candidates and elected officials are much more likely to respond to the interests of those who vote. And so some people argue that they lack what's called efficacy. They don't believe that their vote matters. Well, maybe not in the short term, but over the long term it certainly does. And this is where political socialization becomes such an important consideration in shaping the long-term developments of the state of Texas, encouraging people to believe that their vote matters. So on the whole, it's not rational to vote, yet people are willing to bear the costs of actually standing in line, getting information, getting registered to vote. And so scholars refer to this as the paradox of voting. Almost everything else we do in our lives, we do because, well, the benefits are greater than the costs. Voting is that one big exception. Hence, it's a paradox, something that we still struggle to fully understand.